Have you ever seen a tombstone like this in an old cemetery and wondered who that person was or whatever happened to them? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about Ida Bates, who was murdered supposedly by her husband in 1892. And her husband was lynched outside of the Shelbyville courthouse just a few days later. We're going to dive into the story of Ida Bates and her husband William, so stick around. Okay, this one took several turns on me. I started out with a newspaper article from 1892 where a woman was found dead by her husband, and I thought to myself, there's probably no way they figured out who did it. But it kept getting deeper and deeper the more articles that I found. I don't know for sure that they punished the right person. By the end of this video, I want you to have all of the same information that I came across, and you decide for yourself and let me know in the comments what you think. So let's dive in. In this case, we have Ida Bates, born Ida Kuntz. This comes from the Knoxville Journal on Saturday morning, June 25th, 1892. Awful tragedy. A Tennessee lady ravished and then murdered. A Tennessee lady ravished and then murdered. Her husband returns home only to find her mangled corpse in a clover patch. The perpetrator unknown. Mrs. Bates, the wife of a respectable young farmer living near Shelbyville, or Shebville, in Bedford County, was outraged and murdered today, and there is no clue to the perpetrator of the horrible double crime. The woman was last seen alive by her husband when he went into the field at an early hour this morning. At about noon, he quit work and went to the house for dinner. His two young children were playing in the yard, but Mrs. Bates was missing. The children said she was in the garden, and Bates went to see what delayed her. She was not in sight, but on the ground there were many footprints and evidences of a struggle, while pieces of his wife's dress were scattered around. Now thoroughly alarmed, Mr. Bates quickly followed a trail through the weeds to his clover patch, and there found the mangled corpse of his wife. She had been dead some time. The corpse was almost nude, her face mutilated beyond recognition, and her skull crushed in by a broken fence rail, which lay near. She had been outraged, and the brute had then murdered her. There is a great excitement in and around Shebville, and there is no doubt as to the fate of the fiend if he is discovered. Yeah, that one's pretty bad. So who killed Mrs. Bates? Let me preface the rest of this video first by saying that I try to keep this channel PG, and there's certain words from the past that advertisers nowadays really don't want in videos. So that's why you'll notice I intentionally changed some terms. This was out in the middle of nowhere and a good 100 and something years before DNA analysis was ever even thought of. From this first account, we know she was outraged. That word means probably what you think it means. Her clothes were ripped off and she was attacked with a fence post. Her husband comes home from working in a field and finds all this. I can't imagine what that would have been like. But wait. Her husband was killed 2 days later by lynching. So William was the son of James Scott Bates. Ida was born after the 1870 census and is missing from the 1880 census, but they got married in 1888 in Bedford County. William was arrested on suspicion of killing his wife. Then an angry mob collected before dragging him out of jail to hang him in front of the courthouse in Shelbyville. Bates lynched the murderer of his wife hung by a mob. Avenging work was done in broad daylight. William Bates, the white man who was arrested Saturday morning on the charge of having murdered his wife on the day previous at their home near Roseville, Bedford County, and committed to all at Shelbyville Saturday evening, was taken from the jail at 1:10 o'clock this morning by a mob and hanged in the courthouse yard. He died protesting his innocence. Scott Bates, father of William, was in jail on the charge of horse stealing, and it was suspected that young Bates murdered his wife to prevent her from testifying against her father-in-law, and that the murderer was investigated by the elder Bates. The mob also took the old man from the jail, but was finally prevailed upon to spare his life. So it appears that William's dad, Scott, was already in jail in Cheville for stealing horses. And William's wife, Ida, was a key witness. Her testimony would either give William's dad an alibi or doom him to several years in jail. The mom was convinced that William killed her because she had planned to not testify for William's dad. So, in their mind, they lynched a wife killer. And I found a picture of that day on Ancestry. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that all this went down exactly like the mob thought. But before I go any deeper, please give this video a like and a subscribe, and be sure to check out our shop for t-shirts and coffee mugs. Any support helps more than you could possibly know. So why am I not completely convinced that William did it? Well, let's take a look at some new details. The biggest piece of evidence was a witness to the event. And this article says that she witnessed the crime from the door of her house some distance away. She described the shirt and hat worn by the murderer, but could not tell who he was from where she stood, nor whether he was white or black. It is generally believed that the African-American woman knows more than she has told, but from some cause is afraid to testify. So we have one witness who, at the time, admitted to being so far away that she couldn't even tell if the guy who was assaulting Ida Bates was even white or black. So she was pretty far from what was happening. But yet her statement was basically enough for an angry mob to gather from several different towns around the area and overpower a sheriff, take his keys, and nab William out of jail and drag him kicking and screaming 3 blocks up the road and hang him in broad daylight. All of that based on testimony from one woman who admitted to not even really being able to see who it was. Now, in some articles, she did say that she had witnessed the two of them getting into fights and maybe some abuse taking place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he killed her. I don't know. It all starts getting even more confusing when we look a little bit more into his dad, the horse thief, Scott Bates. He was sitting in jail for charges of stealing horses, and it was reported that he told William he needed to get his wife to testify to say that he was at the house with them the night of the horse stealing. So she was going to be his alibi. And I had to see this jail for myself, because it's still there. So I'm out here at the Bedford County Jail where they held William and his dad, Scott Bates, for their crimes. And I think it's probably exactly what it looked like back then. And if you walk around the corner, we can see the courthouse where they dragged them out and took them to. Right up there. So they would have dragged William and his dad Scott out of that door right there. I imagine it wasn't a metal door back then. It probably looked like something else. And took them out, up around to the courthouse. And I see a couple of trees up there I'm gonna go check out. It's kind of hard to imagine now this town square filled with dozens or even hundreds of people out to do one thing, and that's to publicly lynch somebody from this tree. I've driven through this square I don't know how many times. I never even would have thought about that. But there it is. William's dad, Scott, was a detective. And he was in the habit of making people mad in the area, especially in Wartrace, where he was working on a case involving a saloon that burned down. Apparently, there was a bit of arson involved, or back then they called it incendiary. Not only that, but prominent citizens in the town were implicated for insurance fraud. Most of the crowd that came to lynch his son were from Wartrace, which isn't that far by railroad. There is an article a couple months after the murder and lynching in the Chattanooga Daily Times that talks about Scott's employer, a Detective Shackelford out of Atlanta. This guy said that Bates was a perfect gentleman and incapable of any mean act, which is to say his flabbers were gasted when he found out that Scott was in jail for stealing horses. He believed that Bates was on the track of an incendiary case in Bedford County which implicated prominent citizens, and that in order to foil Bates in his efforts to bring him to justice, the charge of horse stealing was trumped up against him and thus thrown in jail. This article was written by C.B. Murphy. However, this article, in particular, goes on to put Scott Bates's career and personal character on blast. It refers to this incident 3 years before where Henry Stokes, a peaceable citizen of Haley Station, was cruelly beaten at that place last Saturday by Detective J. Scott Bates. Bates had accused Stokes of interfering with some of his business affairs and met him on the platform, accompanied by his son. Yes, it was William. And accosted him about it. This article doesn't say anything at all about what started it, but it spends a lot of time talking about Henry being a victim and he was senselessly beaten for apparently no reason. This article was also written by C.B. Murphy out of, you guessed it, Wartrace, Tennessee, the same place where Scott Bates was investigating this arson case of prominent citizens. C.B. Murphy clearly did not like Scott Bates. He said himself that he had come along to the lynching and protested the whole thing. He even said, "Oh, he's not a real detective. I know that he has only been doing it since 1888, when a state concern flooded the country with detective badges for anyone who wanted to do it and had $5. But that's a lie, because here's an article from 1886 in Cowan, Tennessee, a good 2 years before 1888, where J.S. Bates of Haley Station arrested a guy from Maryland for, can you guess, theft of a horse. So, was C.B. Murphy a terrible reporter, or was he lying to cover someone he knew that Scott was starting to figure out? Which begs the question, who had the most motivation to kill Ida? Or for that matter, who had motivation to kill William? I'm not saying Scott or William were perfect people. I just think it's odd. And leave a comment down below if you think it's a little strange too. Or if you think I'm way off and he absolutely did it without any question in your mind. But hear me out. What if Detective Scott Bates figured out the arson case in Wartrace? They catch wind of it and decide to come up with some stolen horse charge and frame him. They find out he's working on an alibi involving two people, his son William and his daughter-in-law Ida. So they kill Ida and frame William. I mean, William was screaming his innocence the entire time, and the mob tried to lynch Scott too. 2 birds with 1 stone. But the sheriff talked him out of it and got him away to Rutherford County, which is where Murfreesboro is. Now, both people who could give Scott an alibi, whether he had been with them that night or not, were dead. Scott Bates no longer has any hope for an alibi, gets convicted for 7 years. His credibility as a detective is totally ruined, and the insurance fraudsters get away with it. And C.B. Murphy writes some fresh smear articles about Scott just in case anybody wants to have thoughts like myself or Detective Shackelford. I'd also like to point something out about our dear reporter, C.B. Murphy. I couldn't find very many articles that he had written because a lot of times articles didn't have the author written, but I did find this one from 1887, and it's a pretty scathing article he wrote saying why they should not declare to them their duty as citizens in an issue which is purely moral, which has for its sole object the removal of an unmitigated snare and curse from the land, the saloons. In this country, the whole liquor traffic is doing as much to corrupt and degrade our Christian civilization as the idol groves of the heathen did to destroy the worship of the true God in the times of ancient Israel. Happy for the church and for the commonwealth that there are mighty men of valor like Gideon who will array the people against this evil. Now, not only did C.B. Murphy write some pretty scathing articles about Detective Scott Bates, but he also had some pretty big feelings against saloons and liquor. Bates got hit with stolen horse charges while investigating a saloon burning down. And for the record, I think Wartrace back then probably had a population of maybe 200 people. It is a small depot town, and it still is. All I'm saying is that I think it would be harder at this point to convince me that William killed his wife because his dad stole a couple horses and she wouldn't lie. And not just kill her, but brutally stab her, rip her clothes off, and then smash her head with a fence post 3 times. I don't know. Color me skeptical, I guess. Not only that, but an angry mob of a couple hundred people were ready to roll after only one witness who couldn't even really tell who it was. All right, so Scott Sr. went to jail for the horse larceny after it was all said and done. But it was short-lived because he was pardoned 4 years later in 1896. According to this article, Turney continues to release the worst men in the pen. And the family went down to Atlanta from there. William's mom, Maddie, she died in a horrific cleaning accident when she was cleaning a necktie and the chemicals she was using caught fire and lit up her dress. She actually stopped, dropped, and rolled, but it didn't help. And her daughter came from the other room to put out the fire with a bucket of water, but it was too late. She died in the hospital a few days after that. So Ida and William had 2 children. And I found a small mention where one of them had died as a baby before 1900, and I couldn't find a marker next to Ida and her parents or anyone in that small little area of the cemetery where they're buried. There were some small stones, so it's very possible that one of those stones is a marker for the baby, but I couldn't make out any words or anything. Her other son, Harvey, lived with Ida's parents according to the 1900 census, but they both died in 1905 and 1906. At that point, he moved in with his uncle Raleigh by 1910, who was about the same age. Harvey grew up and was a veteran in World War I. He became a barber in Tullahoma, Tennessee, until he died in 1940. He was only about 50 years old. And he's buried with his mom at the Lutheran Schaffner Cemetery in Bedford County. I almost missed his stone, but he's there. It's just kind of back in the bushes now along the fence. So I don't know if I believe William killed Ida. It's not out of the realm of possibilities, I suppose. I could be way off, and that she was killed so she couldn't testify on behalf of her father-in-law. But what I do know is her death was horrible. And then her husband was lynched basically the next day. All of us have been through cemeteries and seen thousands and thousands of gravestones. And it's easy to forget that every single one of them has a big old story behind it.